Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Bill Baker with Firestorm. We're pleased to have you joining us for this New Jersey MEP webinar. This is the 6th in the 2016 series. Today we're having a crisis conversation. We're talking about events that have happened in the first half of the year. Our presenter today is going to be Harry Rhulen. He is the chairman of the board of Firestorm. We always need friends. We'd like you to become our friend on Facebook, Firestorm Solutions on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at Firestorm Soul. And there is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We do want to remind you our presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. And this work product should be read in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. In addition, do not interpret this information as legal advice or legal opinion. Our good friends at the New Jersey MEP are the underwriters of this webinar series. You can go to firestorm.com and you can watch past webinars in the series or register for future webinars. Joe Caratanudo is the New Jersey MEP lead on this, and unfortunately Joe is on, well, or fortunately, he's on jury duty today. Blair Neville, though, is with us. Blair is located in New Jersey. Blair, over to you, please.
Great, Bill. Thank you very much. As Bill mentioned, Joe's on jury duty today, so he asked me to kind of fill in and make a couple of comments. And I just want to start by thanking the New Jersey MEP for their support of these webinar and this webinar series. For those of you who may not, maybe the first time on a webinar, or may not be familiar with the New Jersey MEP, it is a group that is supported by NIST. Out of the federal government, and the role of the New Jersey MEP is fundamentally to help and enhance the activity of manufacturers in the state of New Jersey. So the MEP supports programs and helps manufacturers with programs around lean training, sustainability, workforce training, any kind of growth potential and activities, ISO certification, those kinds of things. To help and enhance and help manufacturers improve and get better, and with an ultimate goal of keeping and growing the manufacturing base here in New Jersey. One of their initiatives over the last few years has been with business continuity, preparedness, risk management, and that's where we've partnered with Firestorm to come together to support those activities. And again, this webinar series is part of that activity of education in that arena of continuity and risk management. So again, I want to thank them for their support for us as well as their commitment to that environment. Bill?
Thank you, Blair. Harry Rhulen, as I mentioned, he's the Chief Executive Officer and the founder of Firestorm, and we're pleased to have him as our presenter today. Harry, over to you for the presentation, please.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks, Blair. I've had the opportunity to speak to the New Jersey MEP on several occasions, so for those of you who I've spoken with before, it's nice to be back. And anybody new, I want to just give you the same offer that I always do, which is if you ever have any questions or any concerns, don't hesitate to pick up the phone and give me a call. You know, I'm always happy to talk things through with people. And when it comes to the issue of crisis, you know, it's a world that I tend to live in on a day-to-day basis. A lot of the crisis management response that takes place at Firestorm takes place, the principles of our organization always handle them. So it's important, I think that's a big differentiator between Firestorm and a lot of the other organizations that claim to be crisis management firms. When you call Firestorm, you get Blair, you get me, you get, you know, the people who have actually been involved in the managing of crises. So as we go through and we start talking about some of these things today, I think that it's important to remember that all of you have the ability to identify your organization's next crisis. It's not that you can identify when it's going to happen, but you can identify what can happen. You know, you think about all those different things that we've seen in the news recently, the sexual molestation, the violence, the racism, compliance issues, all of these things. You know that they're possibilities. And if you know that they're possible, you can plan for them. You can start to develop the training, the education. You can mitigate or eliminate a lot of those crisis exposures before they actually happen. So that's what we're going to talk about a bit today. There's so much to go through because the world has been a very tumultuous place over the last 6 months. There's been a lot of crisis. There's been a lot of things that have grown up out of issues that in years prior never really existed. So when you think about the amount of cyber-related issues that we've had, the cyber breaches, the major corporate events that have been caused by hackers, it's getting to be more and more every day. And again, those are the kind of things that you know can happen and that can be mitigated and can be planned for. Especially on the cyber side, the training of your people is so important. People knowing that when certain things happen, you know, cyber's insidious. It's the kind of thing where all of a sudden your computer starts running a little slower, or you open an application and it doesn't open properly. And, you know, most people just ignore that. They say, you know, no big deal, I'll just open it again. And they don't realize that all of those are warning signs. If you think about a computer or a machine, it does everything exactly the same every time because that's the way a machine works. So if all of a sudden one of our computerized machines on the manufacturing floor stops working properly, or it starts doing something unusual, that's a real alarm bell. Something has changed, and that could be a warning. So we actually had a situation recently where a company's systems were hacked through a web-enabled thermostat. So think about that. You know, all of these different things that are hooked up to your systems, all of these different things that have now made your lives easier because they're computerized. You can monitor for compliance. You can monitor for maintenance. You can monitor for all of these things remotely, and they've made your lives easier. That doesn't mean that they haven't created additional exposure. So I think when you guys are thinking about crisis, when you're doing your annual vulnerability and threat analysis, when you're updating your plans, really pay some attention to those issues. What additional vulnerabilities have been created? So again, you know, the slide that's up in front of you now, most of what I was just talking about, that whole digital landscape has changed. And in addition, of course, one of the media digital landscape has changed. So one of the things that we've seen in companies recently is that every employee has a publication device in their pocket. So you've got everyone with a cell phone. They have the ability to shoot pictures, shoot video, do all those kind of things, and they're doing it. They're actually doing it sometimes while they're working. They're filming dangers in the workplace. They're filming other things, and they're publishing them online. So now not only do you have the actual vulnerability or exposure of the accident or incident, but you've got the brand and reputation exposure as well as the regulatory exposure, compliance-wise, that's created by those situations. So it really is an issue that you need to look at, you need to be prepared for. So when you're going through and sitting down with your team, going through that vulnerability and threat analysis, think about the way in which technology has changed your business. In recognition of Muhammad Ali and his recent passing, you know, I saw this quote and I thought it was interesting to share with everybody, because when it comes to crisis, one of the things that we've seen over the course of this year is that people tend to do and say things in those first minutes of a crisis that they really wish they hadn't. You know, everyone wants to defend. Everyone wants to explain why it's not the way that it appears to be. And I think what Muhammad Ali said, silence is golden when you can't think of a good answer. It's always better to be quiet than it is to say something which you'll subsequently regret. And I think sort of the corollary to this for me is slow down. In a crisis, things move very fast, and your brain tends to get ahead of itself. Try and really pull back on those reins and think about, okay, what do I need to do next? Do I really need to take that action? Do I really need to say that thing at this point? So silence is almost always a better answer.
Harry?
So, yes.
Harry, this is Blair.
Yeah, Blair, go ahead.
I hope you don't mind jumping in with
No,
I want to question. I think
anytime.
a great point. I just wanted to ask a quick question. Given what you just said, which I truly believe, how would you deal with being pressured by, you know, the local press? If you're in an incident where, you know, there's cameras around your building, or there's an accident at a plant, and all of a sudden you have that pressure coming on you as well, and you feel like you need to respond. You know.
It's a great question. It's probably one of the main tenets of the crisis communications training that we do, which is be guaranteed when something goes wrong at your plant, you're going to get a call from the press. And almost invariably, they're going to say, Blair, we know that this happened. We are printing an article at 5 o'clock, whether you comment or not. And sometimes, in fact, that happens. And in the article, they write, you know, we could not reach Blair or we reached out to Blair for comment. There was no return call. I would much rather have that printed than have you say something which turns out either to be incorrect, or turns out that you're trying to explain something that can't be explained. You know, trying to explain why a worker died in a workplace accident really can't be done, and it doesn't come across well. Even if it was the work, you know, very often, you know, the worker violated a protocol, they didn't have their harness on, they didn't do whatever it was that they should have done. But you'll see on the screen right now, you know, you see if you're explaining, you're losing. That's one of the critical tenets of crisis communications that you have to remember. Nobody really cares what the explanation is, and of course the press least of all. The press doesn't want you to have a valid explanation. The press thrives and lives on controversy. So they want to make the employer look as though they are at odds with the employee and with the customers and with anyone else they can, because in that way they sell newspapers and they sell airtime. So in today's world, where you have the ability to communicate directly with your employees, directly with your customers, you can send an email, a text, a phone message, whatever it might be, directly to your constituents, where you're not relying on anyone else to interpret your message. So I almost, in today's world, and I'm just trying to think, in the recent crises that we've handled over the last 6 months, I can't think of one time where we interacted with the press. They're going to say what they're going to say. They're going to do what they're going to do. You're never going to convince them otherwise. And one of the things you find out very quickly is that the press are not your friends. They may be people who in peacetime you're friendly with, but when the rubber hits the road, when there's an actual crisis, they will do to you the same things that you see on the nightly news every night. So I think it's a great question, Blair, and it's something that everybody needs to have a media management plan. As part of your crisis communications and your crisis management plan, you have to have in there who the designated spokespeople are. Those people need to have been trained. And as important is, everyone else needs to understand they are not a designated spokesperson. So that's actually one of the things when we're doing that training that we talk to people about all the time. A great line to teach all of your people so that when they do get a microphone thrust in their face is, I'm not a designated spokesperson for the company. I'd be happy to take your information and pass it on. That basically is, everyone can stick to that kind of a line, and it's very effective. So that way you can be sure the message is being controlled by that individual or group of individuals who are designated as the spokespeople. So again, when you're updating and looking at your crisis communications plan, do that in a way where you put in all those new vulnerabilities and threats that are created by media and social media, and make sure if those people on that team haven't received the training, if they're not comfortable with where they're at, it's important, to make sure that you get them to that point. All of you have heard on these webinars before us say that every crisis is a human crisis. Very often especially in the manufacturing environment, we do see that every crisis is a human crisis, whether it's a workplace violence or workplace-related injury situation, or what we've had in the last 6 months, we've had some product recall situations where the injuries were injuries to people, of course. And again, for that individual, it is a crisis, and for that family, it is a crisis. And subsequently, the crisis that gets created for the manufacturer is a crisis not only for the entity itself, but for all the people that work there and everything else. So ultimately, it all comes down to people. And it all comes down to, in terms of those crisis communications, as we were just saying, what should we do now? What should we say now? And making sure that we're not doing or saying the wrong things. So again, we've seen some very dramatic crises over the last 6 months, and management of them, your crisis management plan needs to incorporate the tools so that your people can do what is necessary when that time comes. So I think we all understand that crises have impacts. One of the ways we like to refer to it is that your crisis management plan is not just a crisis management plan. It's a consequence management plan. Because very often, the crisis ends quickly. Regardless of what the event was, the crisis is over, sometimes in minutes, sometimes in hours, but the consequences go on for a lengthy period of time. So I think it's important to understand it's your organization, it's your people, it's your brand, it's your reputation. And it's essential that you're incorporating that thought process into the development and the training. You got those of you who've been on webinars with me before have heard me talk about training. It is the most crucial piece. I would rather have you have a one-page crisis management plan that you have trained everyone on and continue to train on than have some big book that sits on a shelf that no one really knows what's in it, and no one knows what their roles are when the time comes. So I think it's really important to remember that the consequences of the crises are going to change, they're going to grow, it's an ebb and flow process, and it's essential that the training be done in a way where everyone knows what to do and how to do it. One of the things I talk to your members about all the time, when you look at your crisis management plan, when you look at even look at all your planning, your emergency response plan, your crisis management plan, your business continuity plan, if it only tells you what to do, but it doesn't tell you how to do it, you need to do more work. Because what you're going to find is in any crisis, people make decisions that surprise you. They make those decisions because their brain in peacetime functions differently than their brain during a crisis. And therefore, they need exact instructions on what to do and how to do it. So again, as you're sitting down, and I know most of you are, in fact, doing this on an annual, or some of you more than annual basis, where you're reviewing your plans, processes, and procedures. So I very much encourage you, as you're doing that, to do it as a tabletop. Do it as an exercise. I know a lot of you also participate in the exercises that Firestorm does regularly. Make sure your team is sitting around, and would they actually be able to make the decision, implement the decision, and do it the way that you want it done? So again, I think that it's a crucial part of the process. I can't say it enough. Train, train, train. So recently, I came up with a new acronym in the crisis world. The acronym is STOP. I mentioned to you earlier, one of the best things that you can do in a crisis is slow everything down, because things tend to accelerate on themselves, and the situation takes on a life of its own where it's running out of control. And that emotion that happens in those situations, the way you get wrapped up in those situations, can very negatively affect how you respond, and therefore what the ultimate damage is that's done to the organization, to its people, to its reputation. So one of the things I really encourage all of you to do in every crisis or difficulty, it doesn't even have to be a crisis, every situation that occurs, stop for a minute, take a deep breath. And I'm going to talk to you a bit more as we go on about the acronym that we've created around the word STOP, because crisis stop is one of the things we all want to do. We want to stop the crisis. We want to make it not grow to even be a crisis. So I think one of the biggest services that we Firestorm provide in crisis situations when people call us is we pull back on the reins. We get in there and we say, okay, slow down. Let's talk about what's happening. Let's figure out who are all the constituents? What are all the exposures? What are we missing? Because invariably, if we're moving too fast, we make mistakes. We skip things. We forget to talk to our regulator. We forget to put in the call to the family. We forget to arrange, for family members to get to the hospital, to all the different things that in the long run affect the consequences of this type of an event. And by not slowing down, by not thinking it through, we really make the situation less than suboptimal and less than optimal in terms of the outcome. So very much I want to encourage you all to think, as part of your crisis management planning, training, and education, to just keep that word in the back of your mind. Stop. Slow down. So crisis stop. The idea that the first thing that we need to do, we need to stabilize the situation. So invariably, if we're having, whether it's a weather-related event, so just before we got on this call, Karen Masula, who's on the call, was talking to us about the fact that the streets of Charleston look like Venice at the moment. So be sure, for the people who are in South Carolina right now, that is a crisis. Maybe to the rest of us around the country, it's not, because we only see it on the television. But for them, it's a crisis. And they've got panic going on. They've got all kinds of immediate concerns. And they need to stabilize that situation. The first thing they need to do is just get the immediate crisis under control. They need to trigger the appropriate resources. I mean, a lot of times, hopefully as part of your crisis management plans that all of you are doing, you have identified the resources you're going to need. You know how you're going to get a hold of them. In terms of triggering them, what is it going to take? Do they have to be paid in advance? Do they have to have contracts signed? Do they have to have all of these things done so that when it comes time, you can say, okay, go, and they go. So making sure you can trigger those resources is really important. Also, there's so many decisions that need to be made in a crisis, and someone has to opine on what are the exposures, what are the correct decisions to be made. So very often, you're going to involve your lawyers, your insurance agents, your accountants, all those kind of folks. You're going to bring Firestorm in and say, okay, you've seen this kind of situation before. What can we expect? So you need that outside expertise as well as your inside expertise to opine on what are we going to do, what are the exposures we need to be concerned about. And then I think the P is the place where we, Firestorm, really come in, which is helping people to prevent common crisis errors. So when Blair asked earlier about the what's going to happen with the media, be sure that the media are going to be all over you and that there are certain common errors that most firms make in those situations. So when I arrived at Virginia Tech after the shootings there were 140 satellite trucks on campus. There were 325 different media outlets, and after a period of time there were over 1,000 reporters there. As you can imagine, in that environment, the chance that someone was going to make a fairly significant mistake was high. And in fact, they did. They made lots of mistakes. And the other thing that I think is important to remember in a crisis is you can only go forward. So once the mistake's been made, great. Factor it into your process. Look at the vulnerabilities and threats that have been created by it and move on. Figure out what are we going to do and how are we going to do it. But again, the whole concept of stop is one that I want you all to keep in the back of your mind during your process as you go forward. So when we talk about stabilizing, I went through this just a minute ago. I think you have to remember that escalating flow of events, that those of you who have participated in the exercises that we do, and I would encourage all of you, by the way, to sign up for. They're free. We're every other month we do an exercise. So we've done active shooter, we've done cyber, we've got a Zika webinar coming up shortly. Learning about communicable illness, learning about all these things is going to help you understand what the escalation looks like. So when we do the exercises, we actually do them as an escalation. You go from one event to the next, and you see how actual crises unfold. And we actually use fact patterns from actual incidents that we've been involved with. So again, if you can get your team together and participate in those, I would very much encourage you to do that. So that stabilization piece, most of you, of course, have in place. I know you have emergency response teams. You've done the training. A lot of you do exercises around that emergency response function. But it's not just stabilizing the physical issue, whether there's been an injury and you're bringing in 911. A lot of you, I know, have your own EMTs on staff. But then there's the stabilization around that of, making sure that your customers, families, other people know what took place, the fact that you handled it. It goes beyond just the initial crisis or emergency response piece. The triggering piece we talked about, I think one of the things, if we want to trigger resources, again, identifying them and knowing what they are, and knowing that they'll truly be available. So we recently had an issue in a weather-related event where one of our healthcare facilities wanted to evacuate their facility, and the bus company that they were using to evacuate had actually promised their buses to multiple facilities. They didn't understand, the bus company didn't. The bus company was never looking at it as though they would have multiple customers wanting their buses at the same time, because they hadn't looked at it from a catastrophic perspective. So when you're thinking about the resources that you may need to trigger, make sure now in peacetime that they actually have the capacity to do what you need them to do, because otherwise you could wind up in a situation where you call for that resource and it's not available. Now's the time to figure all of that out. So I very much would encourage you to do that. I would also encourage you to talk through and include in your exercises, the people who you're going to look to opine on the various issues. So, if you know your lawyer's going to get involved in opining on a workplace injury because of the OSHA ramifications, include that law firm in the exercise itself, or if from a financial standpoint you don't want to include them in the exercise itself, at least, spend the money for an hour of their time to let them review the exercise itself and give you some feedback on that. One of the things that we've started doing on the Firestorm exercises, for those of you who've participated have seen, we're typically including a large law firm. So we've had Pepper Hamilton on our calls. We've had others. And, Jackson Lewis, which is a very large workplace law firm. They do, as a matter of fact, the only work that they do is workplace law. And I think their slogan is something like, "Work is all we do." And so there's great opportunity for all of you to learn free of charge and incorporate into your plans information that you get from them by participating in those exercises. So I know that I sound like a broken record on the exercise thing, but it goes back to my real core belief that training is the key. Your people need to know what they're going to do and how they're going to do it when the time comes. When it comes to preventing common crisis situation mistakes that people make, I think that's where, again, having appropriate resources, having a Firestorm, having your law firm, having your insurance agent, others involved on your team, people who can prevent you from having that knee-jerk reaction when the press shows up. One of the things that almost invariably happens is the van from NBC News shows up outside your gate, and the guy jumps out with the microphone and the guy with the camera, and they try to bully the guard at the gate into letting them onto the plant property. And that individual needs to be well trained, needs to understand what the responsibility is. Your people internally also need to understand that it is perfectly okay to tell someone from NBC, this is private property, you are not allowed on the property. Now, it's also important to understand that what they're then going to do is set up across the street. They're going to take what we call B-roll footage. They're going to take video of your signs, of your people coming in and out of work. They're going to try and grab people to interview them on the sidewalk, which there's nothing you can do about. It's public property. Knowing all those things, but also knowing that you've trained that individual to say, I am not a designated spokesperson for the company. Now you've prevented one of the common crisis situation problems. So again, I think that whole concept of crisis stop is one that you're going to hear about more and more from us, and I think it's an important piece that we're going to be rolling out to everybody free of charge, because we're so concerned about those first few minutes and those first couple of hours of any crisis situation. We want to make sure that you're all up to speed on where you need to be in those situations. One of the things we've seen, and I alluded to this a little bit a few minutes ago, in terms of why communicate, why talk. A lot of people think of communication as communication with the press. It goes beyond that. As I said earlier, almost invariably my answer is you're not going to communicate with the press. But there's the other question of why communicate at all. So sometimes we've had a couple of situations recently where firms have wanted to put out mass scale emails, including all their customers, all their employees, basically everyone in their email database, on an issue that really only involved a very select group of people. And because the basic premise was that they were trying to explain. They were trying to get everybody to understand and agree that what the firm had done was correct. They wanted to send out these mass scale emails. And in every situation, we were successful in convincing them that this was really a targeted, very small group that needed to receive at least the initial communication. You know, you can always communicate more broadly. You can't take it back. And one of the problems with communicating broadly is you can almost invariably be sure that someone, either intentionally or accidentally, is going to put that in the hands of the media. They're either going to put it on their Facebook, they're going to put it on Twitter, they're going to do something with it that gives it much more broad exposure. So again, start your communications very narrow, keep them very targeted, use your words where you're controlling the message, and do it in a way that's the least likely to cause brand and reputation damage. That whole concept of consequence management. We actually had two situations recently where we had companies make over 1,000 phone calls to avoid the possibility of doing an email where that information then became public. So we actually had teams put together where they picked up the phone, they said, "Hello, Mrs. Smith, I'm calling you from XYZ company. I wanted to make you aware of a situation. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to give me a call." And that was successful, actually beyond our expectation, because in both situations, we did not get any interaction with the press. We did not get any social media. But what we actually got in addition was people saying, wow, this company cared that much that they reached out to me personally. So that was huge. That was actually a lesson for Firestorm. We learned something that we really just didn't expect. So again, controlling your message and controlling your exposure is your responsibility. Ask yourself that question: why communicate? Why am I doing this? Why am I saying this? What am I hoping to accomplish? You know, there are so many crisis strategy questions, and I'm clearly not going to go through all of this with you today. I mean, we could literally sit down and talk about each one of these questions for several minutes, you know, for each one. And when an actual crisis occurs, you know, you want to really sit down and talk about these. So the second one, what is known? You know, and that goes to the first one as well. One of the things you've all heard us say before is that everything you learn about a crisis in the first 24 hours will be wrong. It'll be wrong for some reason and to some degree. So what occurred? Almost invariably, what we think or heard occurred is not what actually occurred for one reason or another. So whenever you're talking, one of the key components of crisis communications, as you've heard us say before, is accuracy. We never start a sentence with "I think" or "I believe." Anything like that means you are not speaking fact. You are speaking about an interpretation of the issues as you think you know them. And if it turns out that the position that you've taken or the statement that you've made is wrong for any reason, it will color every subsequent communication that you make in the eyes of those people. So we never make a statement that we don't know to be 100% factually correct. And we only give the facts. We don't give our interpretation. We don't give our thoughts on how this is going to affect the company or anything else going forward. And that type of training, again, we've got to know who our spokesperson is, that they've been appropriately trained, that we have identified all the vulnerabilities and threats. You know, all of the pieces of a crisis communication strategy. So again, and all of this is stuff that Blair can help you guys with. Do not hesitate for 1 second to reach out if you've got questions when you're sitting with your team, or, you know, if you're going to sit down with your team, I wouldn't hesitate to pull Blair in and have him sit down with you during that process. He can actually help you facilitate those kind of meetings. So think that through, because right now in peacetime, it's a lot easier to do this stuff than it is when something really goes wrong. You all know Firestorm's mantra, the predict, plan, perform. It's a big part of what I've been talking about today. You know, that predictive work. What are the vulnerabilities and exposures? What can go wrong? What is it that we can mitigate or eliminate? We've worked with many of you on developing your corporate plans. And another thing, we've reviewed a lot of your corporate plans, even if we weren't involved in developing them. I would very much encourage all of you to reach out to Blair and talk to him about your plans, about doing a gap analysis of what you've got, so that he can tell you where you're missing pieces. You know, what is it that you could do better? Where are there areas for improvement? Take advantage of that. That's an opportunity to really make substantive change during peacetime that will result in very positive returns if something does go wrong. And then, of course, the performance piece, whether you look at the performance piece as being the piece during an actual crisis, or the execution during your test exercises, your training, all of those pieces, you know, those are all part of performance that come after the planning process. So obviously you see all the things that are on the screen here, and I am, again, not going to attempt to go through them one by one, but I would definitely suggest to you that you go through all of these items with Blair, and you can talk about what pieces are you missing, what pieces can you improve on, are there any of them that Firestorm can help you improve on. Firestorm also, of course, has a very large library of webinars, seminars, white papers, things of that nature that are available to you on our website. So don't hesitate to take advantage of those as well.
Harry?
Yeah, Blair, go ahead.
Can you jump back to the last slide?
Mm-hmm.
Just a couple of points I want to make, especially for any of the manufacturers that are on the line that are looking at the new ISO 2015 certification. One of the key areas, one of the biggest changes, is the implementation of risk thinking and risk planning in your ISO model, which means understanding your risks, understanding vulnerabilities as part of your quality control program. So if you've done that for your continuity program, well, great, you've got that step. But if you don't, to continue with your ISO certification, you're going to have to make that step down the road of understanding, documenting, what are my risks, what are my vulnerabilities, how do I manage them, and how do I integrate that thinking into my quality program. And that's something I've already done for, you know, we've already started that conversation with NJMEP and how we can help with that step. And again, we're not ISO certified. We don't do that type of work. But when it comes to the risk portion of it, that's just, for us, that's just blocking and tackling. It's what we do with all of our customers and clients.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. We're seeing regulators and organizations that do that kind of work, like ISO, bringing risk analysis to the forefront in lots of industries beyond manufacturing. I mean, we're seeing it certainly in financial services and other places. One thing I would also say, Blair, is if anyone does need assistance on the ISO side, we have several expert council members who are very highly trained in ISO-related issues. So if you need that kind of consulting, we can certainly hook you up with those folks as necessary. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the idea that vulnerabilities and threats can be identified in advance, the fact that they can be mitigated or eliminated, is something that all of the rating agencies, the regulators, others are fully understanding now, and it's becoming an expectation. It's a best practice now that you have to have that kind of thing in place. And again, being able to show that your team has sat down and gone through that type of exercise on a regular basis is going to inure to your benefit in terms of the way they treat you if, God forbid, something does go wrong. So I would, again, encourage all of you to have those conversations, and if possible, include Blair in those conversations. I'm going to skip through you've all, well, so the five stages of crisis communications you've all heard us talk about before. You know, the pre-action is what we're talking about now, where, you know, nothing has happened yet, and this is the time to really do all of the things that you need to do. Once onset occurs, we're into it, we're implementing, we're slowing down, we're stopping, we're doing all those things I just talked about. After it's over, now we're into impact assessment. This is that whole both crisis management and consequence management phase. Then we get into response and recovery and post-crisis. So, you know, we could do literally a whole, not only webinar, we do full day training on these different phases. So we can talk a lot more about that. And when I started the call, I told everybody, don't hesitate to pick up the phone and call me. If you've got questions on any of this kind of stuff, I'm more than happy to talk to you about it, as is Blair. And I think, you know, when we talk about crisis and crisis communications, you know, there's the coordination aspects, the actual crisis and the communications pieces. And then I know a lot of you have compliance-related issues that you have to deal with. It's important, even those who are not compliance-driven, there's a compliance piece to communicating that you have to incorporate into your crisis communications plan. So, you know, we're happy to help you do that. We have already talked about the whole predict, plan, perform methodology. You know, knowing who you're talking to, what you're talking about, making sure the messages are specific and formatted to that stakeholder, and that you're not giving them too many messages, you know, focusing on the 3 key messages. So, you know, in closing, I think knowing what you have, knowing what you need to do, back to that whole issue of that you can identify your organization's next crisis. There's no question that that is the case, and we would love to help you do it, but we really want to help you. We want to push you to make sure that you are, in fact, doing it on a regular basis. So Blair, with that, I don't know if you have any final comments you want to make. And Bill, I don't know if anyone has submitted any questions during the presentation that we could, you know, we've got a couple minutes. We could certainly address those now.
No, I'm fine. I just, you know, I just wanted to just reinforce those 2 points, and I think that it is, it's interesting that a lot of the, you know, certification agencies are driving that idea of risk as a planning tool and not just a mitigation, you know, a mitigation tool where it has been in the past. Is how do I prepare if something goes wrong? Now it's part of your entire business process, and it's just becoming one of those planning items that you know you have to look at when you're looking at your business. And again, it's something that I'm working with the NJMEP on to put together some training and some workshops just on that aspect of it. And you know, and my feeling is it not only enhances the quality aspect, but it also helps, you know, really protect the business as well.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, risk is both a positive and a negative thing. You know, without any risk, there's no opportunity. But there's no question there's a balance there, and you know, most people think of risk as a bad thing. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's what creates the opportunity for real gain as long as you're managing it properly. So,
oh, great.
Bill, did we have anybody who had any questions submitted?
No, sir. No questions. Thank you.
Okay, well, in that case, I think we're going to end today's webinar. And again, if anybody has any needs, reach out for Blair, reach out for me. And we look forward to talking to you again soon on another webinar.
Great. Thanks. area. We really appreciate your time on this.
Thank you.